Hi, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Amy Ash, and over the next 20 minutes or so, I'll be talking about the creation of a forest elf, the release of Mari 6, and the importance of considering story in all stages of character creation. Firstly, a little bit about myself. I'm a lead character artist for cinematics, currently working at Goodbye Kansas Studios in Stockholm, and previously I was with Axis Studios in Glasgow. I've worked in illustration and animation for advertising and cinematics for over 20 years, with past experience as a generalist with a focus on character concepting, modeling, and even animation, before deciding to specialize in character asset creation. Projects I've worked on in the past include the first season of the Tales of Runeterra shorts for Riot Games, the Love, Death and Robots Season 2 episode for Tallgrass, and cinematic trailers for games such as Diablo Immortal, Deathloop, and most recently, Forspoken. Towards the second half of last year, the Foundry asked me to create a hero character asset for use in the advertising and splash screen for Mari 6, which was obviously an opportunity I didn't want to miss. They provided me with a detailed brief and a full deck of example images for composition, mood lighting, and color palette. This was also to be a collaboration with Texturing XYZ, who would supply me with one of their excellent V-Face packs for the character's face, along with any other resources I might require. The creative direction in the brief was clearly geared towards a humanoid fantasy character, shown from the shoulders up in a mystical forest-type setting, with good use of warm, rich colours. I set about making some early, broad decisions. I wanted to create a strong, older female character with authority. This was very much personal preference because I wanted to give myself the opportunity to do something different to the young, pretty female characters that are very common within this industry. So I decided that she would be a matriarch, maybe royalty or a member of the nobility, but I also wanted her to have a bit of a combative edge. So I started leaning towards coming from a group that's seen a lot of conflict and hint that she herself has led people into battle. Finally, I was keen to do something a little different anatomically whilst retaining an overall human look, so I settled on creating an elf. So now I have the bones of a character. She's a leader in a group of warrior-like forest elves, older and wiser for it. As with any project, there are obviously some challenges to overcome, and the main one on here was the available time, as the deadline was reasonably tight and the work needed to be done in my spare time alongside a full-time job, during a busy period at work. It's important with any new project to assess what may impact what's possible, whether that be budget, time, or available resources, and how this may affect the final look of the asset. In this case, I decided to avoid creating any hair for the character, as a groom for a female fantasy character could be very time-consuming. Therefore, I need to create a design that would cover her head. At this point, I want to talk a little bit about the use of story in creating characters. I'm no writer or expert on story structure, so everything I say here is very much how I consider a character story when creating an asset. A lot of this will likely sound obvious, but it's surprising how often it can get dropped by the wayside or forgotten about. When you start creating a character model, depending on what the character is for, the story may come from one of several different sources. If it's a commercial project, the client may provide a storyline or biography for the character. This may be existing lore from a long-running IP or something new entirely. If it's a hero character, you can have lots of information, but for background assets, it's likely you'll have very little other than the character's general role and actions in the film's narrative. But even here, I think it's important to establish creative keywords that describe in some way the biography of the character that you're creating. For personal projects, again, it could be drawing on existing lore or literature, especially in the case of fan art, or you might be creating something entirely from scratch. But regardless, when it's a personal project, you have the ability to take it in any direction you want. When I'm thinking about a character story, I like to divide it into two parts, the backstory and the narrative. The backstory covers the overall biography of a character, who they are, how old they are, where, when, and how they live, who they live with, and the culture they are a part of, what they do, and any major past events that have shaped them in their life. The narrative is more concerned with the character's situation in the moment we are creating. What environment are we in right now? What are the atmospheric conditions? And what are the events that the character is in the middle of? This will obviously have a massive impact on the look of a character. He could be a rich businessman in a fine suit, but if he's in the middle of a drunken brawl in the rain, it's pretty clearly going to be odd if we don't show that in the modelling and texturing of the asset. This helps us make creative decisions about the overall look of a character, but story can be extended to every element of asset creation. How the dirt builds up on someone's face, where damages are most likely to occur, the type of aging in a costume, all this will be impacted by those story elements. Similarly, every object the character carries or wears will have its own story, tied in some way to the character's story. In this case, the backstory is how it was made and by who, what function or purpose does it serve, what is the quality of its construction, and how has it been used and maintained up to this point. The narrative would again consist of where it is right now, the environmental conditions, and the events happening in the scene and how the object is being used by the character and the effect this has on the condition of the object. Consider, for instance, this knife from textures.com. There's a lot of history within it. We can see where regular contact with a hand that's gripping it tightly has darkened and polished the leather on the handle, or how the direction of the scratches on the guard describe the repeated downward cuts it's been used for. It's very old and functional and not very well taken care of, so there's evidence of corrosion and pitting on the blade, and the notches at the end of the blade suggest it's been used to cut harder materials, maybe wood or bone. Going back to the forest elf, I needed to create this character's story myself. I had the bare bones of a backstory at this point, but I needed to explore how this would run through to the details. I started roughing out an idea by working on a speed sculpt in ZBrush. Whenever I'm working on a head without a scan to start from, I prefer to start from a sphere, as personally I find that if I use an existing base mesh, I'll end up spending too much time trying to remove the features of that base mesh from my work. You can see here a little bit of my process, and I will freely admit that most of my speed sculpts of heads look bad for about 70% of the sculpting time. It's only towards the end that it comes together for me. If you look at any of my videos on YouTube of my character sculpts, you'll see the same thing. I tried out a few different ideas that were in my head and finally ended up with an initial block out. It's not detailed, but it's enough for me to get an idea of the forms and decide what's working and what's not. In this case, I decided that it hadn't been hugely successful. The silhouette wasn't interesting, there's no connection to the forest environment in the design, and she doesn't feel like a warrior, but instead a much more regal character, especially with that maya-like chain around her neck. So I started to do some paint overs in Photoshop with the aim of giving her a stronger connection to her habitat and a rougher, spikier silhouette. I gave her a collar made up of leaf shapes that's designed to make a silhouette more imposing and angular. I wanted the crown to be much less rigid and geometrical in its shape language, and more representative of roots and branches. So I designed a headpiece consisting of a metal lattice that twists around itself and has thorn-like elements at the top. The antlers help balance out the asset a bit, but I also thought they could be worn in a crown due to the value her culture places on the creature they come from. The armour itself continues the branch and root theme, with more details curving and twisting around on the surface. In the second iteration, I also started to add more piercings and some decorative scarring on her face. I liked the tribal element that this brought to her. After a few more iterations, I arrived at this final concept. By this point, I'd added some finer details to support her standing in society, such as the embroidery on the hood, and to break up some areas and add interest. The Foundry gave me some really great feedback throughout, and they were very keen to push colour wherever possible. From this arose the idea of her eyes being green like the gem in a crown, which makes the gem almost appear like a third eye as a symbolic representation of her wisdom. From this concept, I created a material call-out. The story elements that are in place by this point all impacted the decisions made here. For instance, she lives in the forest in a warrior-like culture that has a structure and hierarchy, but still has some religion, like an early belief system in Europe. So I wanted her armour to be competently made, but not the finest craftsmanship and materials. And I wanted to avoid luxurious fabrics and instead go with wool and muslin. Some parts of the metalwork could be rougher in construction with visible hammered surfaces. The crown itself, I wanted to be a little rougher still, as if this is the oldest part of her costume. Maybe it's been handed down through generations. I also use a sheet to record ideas for smaller repeating patterns, such as the embroidery on her hood, and how the tree and root motifs could be used within them. Once I had sign off from the Foundry, I could kick on with the modelling. This is a combination of sculpting, polymodelling, and Marvelous Designer for some of the fabrics. Everything was taken back into ZBrush for a final sculpt. I prefer not to spend too long getting things perfect in Marvelous when I know I can fix a lot quite quickly in ZBrush. The mesh itself is fully quadded, but maybe not as even as a production mesh would be. This is simply a case of keeping in mind the usage of the asset and picking my battles a bit. The head mesh uses the texturing XYZ base mesh, which I projected onto my sculpt using ZWrap. This meant I could try out multiple V-face packs very quickly, as they all share the same base mesh. The sculpt for the head is clean beyond the secondary shapes and bigger wrinkles, as I wanted to make the most of the displacement layer in the V-face map. UVs came next, and these are important to get right to make texturing easier for yourself later down the line. Nearly all of the shells have the same textile density, which is very important for any elements such as cloth, where you need the pattern you apply in the map to be the same size across all areas. I organised UDIMs into rows as well, according to material type. So I had a row for metal, a row for cloth, and another for leather. This is just easy for organisation and for when you're looking at UDIM numbers later on. Finally, any shells that would have smaller patterns on, such as embroidery applied, needed to be straightened out to make this easier later on. So this is the final sculpt. This could definitely have been taken further, but time was against me at this stage and it was important to get it into LUTDev. The beauty of not working in a pipeline in this case means you can change the mesh whenever you want, so I felt if anything was really not holding up, I could return to it later, and in some cases I definitely did. On the metals, I added in some damages and broke up some of the edges, but it's important to get details on metals right, as otherwise it can massively undermine your textures. Again, if you want to add in damage, think about the story. How would that damage have been inflicted and by what? Armor is most likely going to be hit by sharp metal objects. Scratches with soft, blurry edges will never look right in this case, so I make sure any scuffs and scratches I did were sharp in the sculpt. Any softer damages I imagined would be the result of blunt impacts causing dents, imperfections in the manufacturing, or attempted repairs such as hammering out dents. Once the sculpt was finished, I baked out normal, curvature, concavity, and occlusion maps in Knold from the displacement maps. You can bake the maps out in a whole bunch of programs, but I like Knold because it gives nice clean occlusion maps. So here we are in Mari. I have a geometry loaded in just for the armor, and in the objects panel here I've loaded in the baked mesh maps into the geo channels, so I can easily bring them in using a geo channel node for use in masks. I'm also using the node editor. It's a really nice way of working, and in my opinion a lot easier to navigate than traditional layers. I've set up the channels I need, and I've created two materials based on Arnold standard surface shaders. One for the metal and one for the leather, with a paint node for the mask. Inside the materials, I'm trying to keep things fairly organised using backdrops to group channels. I've already set up basic colours for each channel, and now it's a case of building up detail. With metals, I usually start by getting some roughness variation in there with merge and colour nodes, using grunge maps that suit the look I'm going for as masks in tiling nodes. You can add in a levels node to control the contrast of the mask. With the nodes, it's possible to bring masks across to different channels easily as well, so I could use one mask to control the roughness and diffuse variation. Next up, I want to add a lot of fine scratches to the surface of a metal, generally from polishing or any minor impacts that it gets. Even if you don't clearly see them, they add a lot to the look of a metal by breaking up the roughness and spec in a realistic way. Keep these scratches only in a rough channel and set them to a very low amount of roughness. I can use the baked mesh maps in the geo channels to create masks based on mesh details and add filters such as blur to these in bake point nodes so that it's not destructive. Again, I just merge in other maps such as grunge maps or procedural noise nodes to break this mask up a bit. I want most cavities to be a bit darker and rougher where the metal is less polished. From here, it's a case of continually adding variation and detail. There's nothing really fancy about my process technically. It's more based on observation of references and understanding what type of variation and detail you want based on the narrative of the scene and history of the object. I like to add some subtle colour variation to metals just to give it a bit of life. Again, even when it's not immediately visible, it still brings something extra. For further variations, I build up masks by merging tiled maps, and then I can use a paint node to multiply the result, so I'm only revealing those details in areas I want to. I'll do the same for pitting. I want this armour to be a bit older, so it'll naturally have some evidence of surface corrosion in some places. And if you look at any old metal, the first sign of this will be small spots where the top layer of the metal has been eaten away. The pitting does need adding into the bump, roughness and diffuse, but again it's best to use the multiplied paint node mask so you're only revealing it in certain areas. Try to think about where the dirt would build up and attack the metal first. Once you're happy with your base material, you can layer on any dirt that sits on top of the surface and would not be metallic. I do this in a new material so I can keep it separate for organisation and also export the mask for use in shading, where I'll use a layer shader in Arnold. Here I'm just getting some variation to the colour, roughness and bump within the dirt material, then I can work on the mask. Dirt is one of those areas where story really does come into play. Very often when junior artists are asked to add dirt to something, they might do something a bit like this. A grunge map mask applied across the entire surface. This not only looks unrealistic, but it can also result in a lot of visual noise, and the first comment you are likely to get back is that the dirt feels arbitrary or unintentional. Therefore, we need to build up a more complex dirt mask and consider how and where the dirt might build up. You will need to start painting into the mask rather than using any procedural methods to get a really good result, and you can spend a fair amount of time doing this if you're adding in a lot of detail. On this armour right now, I'm thinking that there's maybe some older, drier dirt in some areas and a bigger, fresher splash to the right side. I use a paint through image tool to place details where I need to. Finally, we can keep adding details to push and support the story of our character. If, for instance, I decided to make her part of a more advanced society, maybe we'd want her armour to have a more intricate detailing, and we can easily add this quickly in texturing. If needed, this could also be put into a displacement map, especially if we get very close to the armour in shot. This is where I was able to get to on a metal armour in a relatively short amount of time. By studying and understanding the materials you're making, you'll be able to replicate them much quicker. The Forest Elf obviously has a lot more different materials than this, but I follow a similar process. Get reference, build the base material, and layer elements up to get the look I want. For instance, on the cloth, I used the Texturing XYZ muslin tiling map for the weave, but then I added in directional noise, going through a levels node to add variety to the horizontal weave. I did this at a couple of different sizes to break up the surface more, and then added bobbles and staining and dirt on top. The final render was done in Maya and Arnold, with a 16K V-face map split into channels providing the skin details. I used the region masks Texturing XYZ provides to be able to dial in the strength of the displacement and the roughness of the skin per region. Finally, I added fuzz onto the clothing to add realism and break the texture map surface feeling. As with any asset or image, and especially what you are doing to a deadline, there's numerous things that you will look at and think you could have done better. If I were to go back to this, I'd spend more time getting more variation and wear into surfaces and adding more details that I think would support what I was trying to communicate about the character. Some specific damages or wear would have been nice, such as maybe the odd hole or stray thread in the fabrics. The leathers should look more used and tatty, especially in places where they will come under stress from bending in use. And the antlers, I feel, could have more love to them and more history. But there always needs to be a point where, as an artist, we stop, move on, and apply what we've learned to make the next asset that little bit better. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful in some way. Please check out Mari 6, especially the roller stamp brush if you haven't already. It's great. Thank you so much.